Hello, I'm Wiltus, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the idea of intrinsic value and why I think that intrinsic value, in most ways that it is used, is actually unrealistic. In other words, it does not correspond to the real world, the world that actually exists, the world that we interact with. So, in other words, intrinsic value, the idea that things have value in themselves outside of their relationship with other things or objects, can be explained in a few different ways. And I think the most natural type of intrinsic value that you can make is a tautology. In other words, let's say this dog is worth this dog. In other words, tautologically speaking, that is, making a statement comparing something to itself, uh, a dog will be worth that same dog. In other words, x equals x. Very mathematical. So, in that sense, that's, in my view, a very simple explanation of something that I think can be said to be true in regards to intrinsic value. In other words, everything's value is its own value. Now, that doesn't actually explain anything because that doesn't allow you to compare anything, which is important when you're establishing a values system, because in a values system you need to be able to compare values. But if all your values are tautological, it means that all objects in a universe have their own values and are entirely unique and inexchangeable. In other words, value in that sense really only describes the idea of identity, and under a system of identity, you can't really do moral calculations or economic calculations because valuation is a moral phenomenon, but it's also an economic phenomenon, and there's other types of valuation that happen. Now, as an extension of a tautology, you could say that intrinsic value is compositional. In other words, a thing is worth not only itself, but is worth its components and the way in which those components are together as the thing. And I think it's very important to say that, because saying that a thing is worth its components without saying that it's worth those components and in the way in which they are together to make the object is not warranted. In other words, uh, for example, you take a human body, and a human body might have some value in some context. For example, in the context of organ donation, there is a very real economical value to the human body. But if you were to separate the human body into its component elements and have those separated, when I say elements, I'm speaking of chemical elements. So you've got the hydrogen, the oxygen, the carbon, the nitrogen, maybe some sulfur in there, manganese, iron, various elements. And you separate those obviously have a very different economic value. So, in that sense, it is demonstrably true that the valuation of something is different when its components are separated. In other words, this compositional valuation that I'm talking about, this compositional intrinsic value, is dependent entirely upon the composition, in other words, the togetherness of these things in one place as the object. In other words, it's essentially an extension of the tautology. And the composition also does not only refer to the downward composition, as in breaking up the object into its qualities, but also the upward composition, which is the object as a component of something else. For example, let's say you have a GPU. A GPU can have value, but its value is also dependent upon whether or not it's part of a machine. If it is, then that can change the qualities of the GPU. In other words, the quality of the GPU is different by being part of a machine than it is by not being part of a machine, because that is objectively a circumstantial difference. And you might say, well, maybe it's an irrelevant difference. Why is it not an irrelevant difference whether an object is part of something or not part of something? Well, the answer is, why should that not be a difference? Because if we can describe an object and use its composition as part of another object as a descriptive factor, then that's obviously something that contributes to the identity of the object. And in that sense, it is very easy to say and very easy to see that these objects are in fact different. Furthermore, even if all objects that we are discussing in comparison had the same physical composition and immediate surroundings, we would still have to deal with the fact that those two objects are most likely in different places. In other words, you might say apples and oranges. You can say that there's an obvious difference there, that you might not put an equivalence between an apple and an orange, but between two apples that have the exact same shape and the exact same chemical composition and the exact same even sentimental value, those two apples are still two distinct apples that are in different locations, and therefore their value may be affected by this. In other words, because they are not in a sort of, you could say, con position, where they're together in one place in the same position, there's a distinction that you can make. Therefore, the tautology of one apple will not apply to the other apple. In other words, you can say that there's this apple and that apple, and those two are different apples. Therefore, its tautological value is different. So the tautology that applies to one apple does not apply to the other apple, because then it ceases to be a tautology, and therefore the intrinsicness of the intrinsic application of the intrinsic value is denied. So, of course, an exception to this would be if the two objects are in a, as I said, con position, the exact same place, position, composition, and they react in this exact same way to the environment, and if parts of them are taken off, those parts react in the same way. But when you get to that point, from a pragmatic perspective, it's actually irrelevant that there's two different objects. And from an empirical perspective, it's impossible to discern that there are two different objects, because all you have is what seems to be one apple, but which, in fact, under this hypothesis, and this is a sort of science fiction hypothesis, it's two apples, but they just happen to be in the same place and have the exact same qualities. So, but I don't think that anything like that has ever been seen to exist, nor do I think it can be seen, at least empirically speaking. Because if it did have the exact same qualities, then empirically you wouldn't be able to discern the fact that there are two apples in the exact same location. Because in doing that, you would have to see a sort of difference between them. So, really, the only difference that you can maybe see is if you have a sort of Platonic direct knowledge, direct ontological knowledge of the apples. But anyway, so this is essentially describing what I like to call the equivalence problem when you're talking about intrinsic value, saying that two things can have the same value despite those two things being different. In other words, those two things not having the same tautology, therefore not being the same object. How can you say that those two things have the same value from an intrinsic perspective? In other words, from the objects themselves, is it possible to say that they have the same value without introducing any external, extrinsic quality by which to compare the two objects? The answer is you can't. So then the question is, if intrinsic value is only tautological and as a subtype of tautological compositional, then extrinsic value, where do you get that from? Where do you get extrinsic value from? And the answer to that question is simple, because value requires evaluation. In other words, if we are saying that intrinsic value is only tautological, but we do have values that are not tautological, we have to figure out where do those values that we do have come from. And the answer is they come from a process of valuation, which is a type of judgment, which is a cognitive, a mental action. And it ascribes a sort of metaphysical value, which is an extrinsic value on an object. And we can see this morally, and we can also see this economically, and in other ways as well. So then the question becomes, where does this valuation occur? And as I said, it is a cognitive action. A rock on the ground, is a rock on the ground that does not have a mind going to apply extrinsic values to other objects? The answer is no. If it does not have a mind, then it cannot apply extrinsic values to objects. Therefore, extrinsic value is established by minds. But for those values to have pragmatic effect on the world, in other words, for those values to have an effect that is useful, an effect that can actually be seen either empirically or realistically or otherwise, they have to be actualized. In other words, I can imagine the price of an object to be anything I like, but if I don't actually have any intention behind that, whatever I imagine is irrelevant, because it doesn't actually have an effect on the extrinsic value of the object unless the valuation is actualized, unless there is a transference from the dynamos, as Aristotle puts it, the potential, to the energeia, the energeia, the energy, the actualization, putting into force what has been imagined in the mind. But what we see then is the requirement of energy, the requirement of force, the requirement of power puts an interesting dynamic on extrinsic value. And what is that dynamic? The dynamic is the power dynamic. In other words, what we see is that extrinsic value is largely dependent on power. And we can see this economically, that large movements, therefore collections of power in regards to consumers, for example, can have an effect on the economic value, the price of an object. We can also see this, I would say, in a sort of legal sense, that the power of the government can establish certain laws which therefore apply certain extrinsic value onto humans or their property, or upon certain actions that humans take, or upon certain events. And that value is applied, and is only applied, if there exists an enforcement for the law. Now, an interesting implication of this is that therefore all value, and by extension virtues, which are essentially in essence based on values, all values derive from authorities. Now, these authorities are not necessarily the same in scope, or the same in the quality of their power. For example, there can be authorities of a workplace, a boss in a workplace. There can be authorities in a country, the government. There can be, hypothetically, supreme authorities, a god. There can be, hypothetically, individuals as authorities exercising self-control over their actions. Or families can have authority structures. And even anarchist movements have authority structures, even as much as many of them would want to get away from that. But in essence, these values can also be formed in a collective structure as well. But what this essentially means is that when there's a difference in values between two sides, one of two things happens. Or, well, there's actually more than two things that can happen. You can have an impasse where there's no interaction of value. You can have one side submitting to the other side, and therefore following the imperative of the other side, which is a form of imperialism. You can have one side forcing the other side, which is also a form of getting them to follow their imperative, a type of imperialism. And by the way, I'm not using imperialism in a necessarily negative sense. I hope that's very clear to my long-term viewers anyway. And you can also achieve a compromise. So there's different modes of interaction there. But essentially this idea is that therefore all value that is not tautological is a value that comes from an authority of some kind. So what does this mean for, let's say, the value of a human life? The answer is the value of a human life is intrinsically tautological, which means that each human life is worth its own value, which doesn't actually tell you anything. And extrinsically, it depends upon the authorities that exercise their power upon that life, whether it be the holder of the life himself, the individual, whether it be the family, whether it be the workplace, whether it be the government, or whether it be God. So, in that sense, humans do not have a sort of full and infinite or immeasurable intrinsic value, except if it is given to them. Now, people can argue whether it is given to them, but I would say that, at least in my experience, it is not something that is given to humans. And therefore, it is not a quality that humans possess. In other words, human rights, and this is the controversial part, human rights only exist if there is someone to give them rights, whether it be themselves, the government, a deity, etc. Human rights only exist as rights that are given and cannot exist as intrinsic rights, because human rights are not derived from any tautology, but rather are derived from extrinsic factors. But in order to value any extrinsic factors, in order to provide a valuation of extrinsic factors, there needs to be a mind. And in order for that mind's valuation of the extrinsic factors to be relevant to whatever is being valued, that valuation needs to be backed up with power. Does that mean that might makes right? Yes, it does. Is that a problem? I don't think it is, because I think that this is how it's always been. Okay, I'm not trying to say that this is how people should live. I'm saying that this is how people do live. I think that there are people that live in a sort of trying to deny that this is how the world works, but ultimately doing that will eventually lead to putting a square peg in a round hole. In other words, the real world is a world that ideally I think people should interact with first as it is, before trying to interact with the world in the way that you would like it to be. In other words, before you can change the world, you first need to know the qualities of the world you live in. And to do that, you need to get a clear grasp on reality. And there are many people that don't like the way the world is, and that try to deny reality through various means. So I suppose this type of statement is very anti-humanistic, because it doesn't affirm that humans have intrinsic values and rights. But I'm going to later on make a more profound critique on the idea of human rights as a whole, because I think that basing your rights, basing it on things that are objectively false, basing your rights on objectively false propositions, will eventually lead to problems in whatever system you're attempting to create. In other words, trying to base your life on the world as you imagine it to be rather than how it actually is very likely to bring problems down the line. And I think that a lot of revolutions that we've seen in the world in the past couple hundred years have really shown this to be a theory with a lot of predictive power, as people operate under principles that are not founded in reality. But anyway, I think that's enough. I think I'll stop rambling here. Tell me what you think. Do you think that there's some other way to derive intrinsic value, whether it be of things or of human beings, other than putting a mental valuation? If you think so, please tell me. Otherwise, thank you all for watching. And if you ever want to come into contact with me, please also tell me in the comments section below. Remember to like and subscribe if you like the video. And if you want to see more, if you have any ideas on a particular topic that you'd like me to cover, please do tell me as well. So anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you all next time on Awultus over and out.